Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started. Um, I our panel today is called Intransigent Power: Mass Uprising for Palestine. We want to thank you all for being here to learn from and listen to our speakers. So today we're gathered in grief and outrage and study to analyze the intransigent power circumventing the demands for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. Since October 7th, millions of people have taken to the streets to protest Israeli genocide. In Gaza, voters have pledged not to re-elect politicians who supported Israel's assaults. University administrators have encountered massive student and faculty resistance to their efforts to repress Palestine solidarity. And Palestinians in Gaza have filled social media with evidence of Israeli war crimes. Despite this really powerful anti-war pressure, shifting policy has proven, of course, incredibly difficult. So what we're asking today is, why has the upsurgence of popular resistance had so much trouble breaking through? Our panel is going to look at the historical, cultural, political, and capital forces in the anti-war movement is facing down, with the aim of equipping organizers. The Palestinian Youth Movement authored a piece yesterday in Shadow Magazine asking exactly this question. Quote, "So why, when there are millions, if not billions, worldwide chanting for ceasefire now, does it feel that our screams are met with silence?" So in what follows, our speakers will attempt to answer this question, drawing on analyses of media disinformation and anti-Palestinian racism, the discourse of the war on terror, Christian Zionism, and donor power. What I'll do in the way will proceed is that I'll introduce our four speakers in the order in which they'll speak, and then I'll let them take it away. And then we'll have a Q&A. So please do feel free to use the Q&A function in the chat to pose questions, and we will have our speakers go through those questions during the Q&A after they're each done with their talks. So I'll do the brief bios of everyone, and then I'll pass it over to them. So first, we'll hear from Michael Arria. Michael Arria is the U.S. correspondent for Mondoweiss. His work has appeared in These Times, The Intercept, The Appeal, and a variety of other places. He's the author of Medium Blue, The Politics of MSNBC. He authors a weekly political newsletter called The Shift, which you can subscribe to on the Mondoweiss website. Next will be Arun Kundnani. Arun Kundnani is the author of What is Anti-Racism and Why It Means Anti-Capitalism, and The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror, among other books. He lives in Philadelphia, and you can follow his work at www.kundnani.org. Then we have Mitri Raheb. Reverend Professor Mitri Raheb is the founder and president of Dar al-Khalima University in Bethlehem. The most widely published Palestinian theologian to date, Dr. Raheb is the author and editor of 50 books, including Decolonizing Palestine, The Land, the People, the Bible, In the Eye of the Storm, The Middle Eastern Christians in the Age of Empire, Politics of Persecution, Middle Eastern Christians in an Age of Empire, The Cross and Context, Suffering and Redemption in Palestine, Faith in the Face of Empire, the Bible Through Palestinian Eyes. His books and numerous articles have been translated so far into 13 languages. He's the founding and board member of the National Library of Palestine and founding member of Bright Stars of Bethlehem, a U.S. 501c3 nonprofit, and a multiple award-winning scholar. Finally, Isaac Kamola. Isaac Kamola is faculty at Trinity College, whose teaching and research interests focus on the political economy of higher ed, African anti-colonial theory, and critical globalization studies. He's the author of Free Speech and Coke Money, Manufacturing a Campus Culture War, and Making the World Global, U.S. Universities in the Production of Global Imaginary. His scholarly work has appeared in International Studies Quarterly, International Political Sociology, British Journal of Politics and International Relations, Millennium, Journal of Academic Freedom, African Identities, Journal of Higher Ed in Africa, Third World Quarterly, Alternatives, Cultural Politics, Polygraph, Transitions, and a number of edited volumes. Thank you so much for our speakers for being with us, and I will pass it over to Michael.
Well, thanks, Jenny, and thanks to fellow panelists and everybody watching. Excited to be part of this important discussion. I was going to talk maybe a little about the U.S. correspondent at Mondoweiss, and a lot of my job is covering kind of how this issue breaks down in the mainstream media. So I was going to talk a little bit about anti-Palestine sentiment in that context. Yeah, I should point out, I mean, maybe at the beginning, as a way to start, I have been, and I think maybe other people too have been, have seen a little more, have seen a little progress when it comes to this issue. Have seen some narratives and some people appear on cable news and in print that perhaps we wouldn't have expected 5 or 10 years ago. Certainly, I think there's a number of reasons for that. Some of it's just the work of activists throughout the decades. I think the diversification of newsrooms. A place like MSNBC has, I think 3 Muslim anchors, old enough to remember when, Phil Donahue was fired from that uh, network for opposing the Iraq War. But having said that, we do, sadly, we have all these recent case studies, 2021, 2018, 2014, where we've seen kind of the same tropes play out when there is these kind of wide scale attacks on Gaza from Israel. And a few things have stood out to me. The big one for me, when it comes to coverage, is really a lack of context, particularly connected to the attack of October 7th. There was a march for Israel the other day in DC, and a sign that I saw consistently was this idea that there was a ceasefire on October 6th, that in some way the violence began on October 7th, and that Israel was simply responding to a violent act. And we've seen that kind of echoed by the mainstream media. The media critic and author Greg Shupak had a really good, I think at this point it's a couple years old, but did a great study of the amount of times that the mainstream media has run articles in recent years using the words Israel and Palestine. And of those articles, I think he concluded that 0.6% have also mentioned the Nakba. So a complete and total lack of historical context on this issue, but also just recent history being left out of the narrative when we see this issue covered. So Israel electing its most right wing government, or racist statements by its leaders, or increased settlement expansion, the increasingly violent raids on refugee camps that we've seen as of late, kind of left out of the narrative. And connected to that, this idea that Israel was kind of forced into this, that they've only been forced into this because they're responding to this act of extreme violence, when in actuality, the failures of the mainstream media, I feel, it becomes kind of compounded if we go back to the Great March of Return, the protests in 2018 and 2019, when over 200 Palestinians were killed during nonviolent protests, over 36,000 injured, I believe over 8,000 children injured. It's not as if the mainstream media has did a good job of covering that at the time. So when they cover these issues now, obviously viewers and readers do not have that kind of wider context. I remember, just kind of connected to that march, reading a piece about a Palestinian who was shot, who survived, but was severely injured, had to have surgery over 20 times, lost his construction job as a result of the injury, fell into poverty as a result of the injury, ended up getting divorced as a result of the stress connected to the poverty. And that's just one story. Obviously, everyone who was injured or every family member that lost somebody during those protests has a story, and those stories are not stories that we frequently see covered by the mainstream. We don't really see Palestinians frequently presented as humans with stories, and we don't see this kind of deepening, widening trauma covered in any capacity that might contextualize some of the things that we're talking about now. So those are some major themes that stand out to me. As the U.S. correspondent at Mondowise, we have staff in Palestine who cover this issue directly, and then my job is to kind of cover how it breaks down within the context of U.S. politics or activism. And I think the way that I've seen it break down, I'll just use one example, and we see this in other ways when we see, IDF officials or quote unquote experts connected to the U.S. government or military. I've seen John Kirby, who, White House official, on the news quite a bit lately. Yesterday, during a press briefing, he was asked whether Israel was carrying out a genocide, and said not only is Israel not trying to wipe Gaza off the map, but he said, in fact, Israel was the one responding to a genocidal threat, which, among other things, is obviously tremendously historical. These are the kind of people that the mainstream media will frequently have on, but the bigger issue is that they're never pushed back upon. Um, and in the introduction to this, Jenny had mentioned that we're seeing this like deepening McCarthyite sentiment within campuses across the United States. Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, has declared that Students for Justice in Palestine campus groups should be "quote unquote" deactivated. At Florida schools, we saw Columbia University suspend their JVP and SJP chapters through the fall term for an alleged unauthorized protests. We saw Brandeis University completely ban their SJP chapter. I talked to the president of the SJP chapter shortly after it happened, and she had said,
So we lost Michael for a second. Let's see.
a consistent guest to talk about issues on cable news has been Jonathan Greenblatt, head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, an organization which has consistently conflated anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. And as we've covered at the site many times, and The Intercept had a piece about this a couple of weeks ago, their methodology for tabulating acts of anti-Semitism throughout the U.S. includes pro-Palestine activism and pro-Palestine protest. And I had just mentioned that Greenblatt, had been on. He's on quite a few cable news shows prior to October 7th, but his amount of appearances has certainly increased, and that he's presented as this kind of authoritative, even objective figure on this issue. When, in fact, the ADL has been pushing and lobbying on this issue for years and years. And in fact, we should really understand some of this McCarthyite stuff on campuses within the context of these pro-Israel groups. The ADL sent a letter to over 200 universities shortly before this wave of repression began, calling on them to investigate SJP chapters over alleged connections to terrorism. This is not something he's ever asked about. And I had mentioned, he came on, he was on MSNBC one evening talking about how the FBI and the IRS should investigate these groups for connections to terrorism, and then was on less than 12 hours later to talk about the March for Israel on the Morning Joe show, in which he said there were over 300,000 people at that march. Wasn't challenged on the number. There was a researcher online who concluded there was probably about 25,000 people at that march. And in fact, was not asked about the fact that one of the speakers at the March for Israel was John Hagee, infamous pastor and anti-Semite, a man who has said the Antichrist will be half Jewish. If there's peace process in the Middle East, it will be led by the Antichrist, the half Jewish Antichrist. Has said that the Holocaust happened because Jews disobeyed God. Has said the Holocaust happened because Jews failed to adequately rally around Zionism in the 40s. Has said that Hitler was sent by God to lead the Jews into the Promised Land, which he believes to be Israel. The ADL live tweeted that entire march, but did not live tweet any of the Hagee speech. Go figure. And Greenblatt is not asked about his inclusion in that at all when he makes the appearance on Morning Joe. So, in addition to misinformation and disinformation, I think he's another example of someone who's consistently on these shows with virtually no pushback whatsoever from the hosts. And the final thing I wanted to mention real quick is when we talk about the failures of the mainstream media, I don't think it's just misinformation and disinformation. I think it's also what the networks and the papers are refusing or are failing to cover. And in recent weeks, we've seen so many protests, actions, sit-ins, people quitting positions of power in protest of Biden's policy in the region. And it seems pretty obvious to me that the mainstream media has not covered this in an adequate way. These are the biggest anti-war protests we've seen in this country in 20 years, and they show no signs of subsiding. There's probably multiple ones occurring right now as we speak. And there's no kind of wider discussion about what that means going forward for young people's views of foreign policy, for the Democratic Party, or for just organizing and activism going forward. If we look at polling over the last few years, I don't think it should be surprising to anyone that young people are more sympathetic towards Palestinians than they were 10 or 15 years ago. I think it's no surprise that the Democratic base, is out of step with lawmakers when it comes to this issue. That Israel and Palestine have become another issue, like the Green New Deal or Medicare for All, where the voters are actually to the left of the people that they elect. And I don't think that has been grappled with or tackled by the mainstream media in any capacity. And I also think they've failed. When you look at social movements, I think it's obviously a mistake. And sometimes the mainstream media does this. Look at them as concise concise moments with beginning and ends, where in my reporting, so many young people I've spoken to in recent years who have come to this issue recently really had their radicalization occur as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests and coming out of the murder of George Floyd. So in many ways, I think these social movements have informed each other and educated each other and have kind of built off that existing activism and protest. And I do feel the mainstream has done a very poor job of assessing the scope of these protests, but also assessing how they will potentially can shape policy and culture going forward. So when we talk about disinformation and misinformation, I think another huge part of this is just the mainstream media missing the overall story in terms of the anger and opposition to not just Israel's policy but the Biden administration's support for that policy.
I've been asked to talk about how framing of a lot of this conversation with the terminology of terrorism is one of the barriers that we're up against. So what I was going to do for about 10 minutes or so is give you a quick kind of historical overview of how the terminology of terrorism has been used, and then get into some of the politics of what that terminology does in the current context of the last few years, especially, and then maybe if you want to in the Q&A, we can get into some of the kind of questions of like, well, how do we respond to this? So, firstly, so the idea of terrorism, that's like a basic concept of terrorism, really comes out of the French Revolution, the aftermath of the French Revolution, the political terror. And so it's actually at that point a term that refers to state violence. And that's pretty much the last time that happens. We then get a kind of second round of using that term terrorism in something much more like the modern sense in the late 19th century, when you get this kind of wave of anarchist assassinations and bombings and so on, and that's really coming out of the repression and the murder of many of the people who were involved in the Paris Commune, and the survivors, having witnessed kind of thousands of their comrades executed by the state, decide that now the only way forward for us is to try and use violence against political leaders. And so you get the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 in Russia, and you get the assassination of President McKinley in 1901, both by anarchists. And this is really the birth of when you get a kind of international collaboration among police forces who are trying to track this kind of international anarchist movement, and the term terrorism becomes central to that. And that's really the modern origins of the term. Then alongside that, through especially in the kind of middle decades of the 20th century, you get the term terrorism used in relation to anti-colonial movements in kind of Ireland, India, Kenya, Algeria, South Africa. In South Africa, the African National Congress described as terrorists. Of course, famously, Mandela was listed as a terrorist by the US government all through his life. And then in the Palestinian movement after 1967, when you get the emergence of the PLO and the Palestinian struggle starts to move away from kind of diplomatic efforts by Arab nation states and military campaigns by Arab nation states, and moves to more something like a guerrilla struggle led and rooted in the Palestinian people after 1967, you start to get the language of terrorism used to describe a Palestinian movement, especially in Israel, less so actually in the United States at that point. In the United States, the picture is more mixed. And really the language of terrorism doesn't really, it's not very prominent in US policymaking in the late 60s, early 70s. You start to see in the early 70s, actually the origin of terrorism in a more systematic way in the US is in relation to the Black Liberation Army and the Weather Underground, these kind of radical groups that are carrying out various kinds of acts of violence within the United States. And, you get in New York City, you get the beginnings of a kind of collaboration between the FBI and the New York Police Department through joint terrorism task forces, which was one of the first kind of institutional responses to terrorism in the United States. A key turning point is a couple of conferences that happen in the United States in the late 70s and early 80s. These are called the Jonathan Institute conferences, The second one in 1984 is actually, these are coordinated by our very own fascist from Philadelphia, Benjamin Netanyahu, who at the time was Israel's representative to the UN, and he organizes these conferences in Washington, D.C. Kind of the first time when speakers are beginning to try and create a kind of alignment of the idea that terrorism is something that is particular to Islam, and it's a kind of product of Islamic culture, right? And so this becomes a very important idea through the 80s and then up to the present day. But it's really the origins of that in the early 80s, and it's clearly part of the response that Israel has to the growing criticism of Israel's policy, especially in Lebanon at that time. Then we get to the period after the Cold War, and that kind of perceived association between Islam and terrorism gets even more powerful. You get people like Bernard Lewis and Samuel Huntington talking about a clash of civilizations, in which the idea of terrorism is kind of pretty closely bound up with that. The idea that somehow there's something about Islam that is fanatical and leads to these kind of barbaric acts of terrorism. And Islam emerges as the kind of new enemy for the US, with communism defeated at the end of the Cold War. Okay, and then obviously that is turbocharged with the war on terror in the 21st century, with a whole massive infrastructure globally established in the name of counterterrorism, and kind of terrorism terminologies everywhere, and it becomes kind of like the one of the main ways in which US foreign policy was organized, one of the main ways in which we're invited to think about the United States' relationships to the rest of the world, right? Now, let's draw out some conclusions we can draw from that, right, in terms of the politics of the term. So firstly, like, what does terrorism mean? If you get the dictionary out and look at it, it's going to tell you something like terrorism is violence carried out against civilians for political ends. It might add something about the purpose is to instill fear and spread fear. So there's something kind of performative or theatrical about it, perhaps. But that's basically the definition. The point, though, is that way of that meaning, that definition, is never applied consistently, right? And this is the kind of crucial thing about the term terrorism, is that if you applied the term terrorism consistently, then you would be condemning 9 times out of 10, you would be condemning Western governments for the violence that they carry out against civilians all the time for political ends, right? So if that was the objective definition, but of course we only ever use the term firstly against non-state actors. It's never the state, it's never government violence, it's always non-state actors that we use the term for. And because the term always has this kind of moral condemnation element to it, we always use it for non-state actors that we're opposed to, never the ones that might be seen to be on our side, right? So the US government never described the Contras as terrorists, it never described the Ku Klux Klan as terrorists, but it has described the ANC as terrorists, the PLO as terrorists, et cetera, right? And so this is, government officials can never use the term without hypocrisy. This is the kind of key point. And so the effect of the word terrorism as part of our discourse is essentially a way of making certain forms of political violence very visible and condemning them, and certain forms of political violence invisible so that they can be shielded from criticism. Okay, that's why as a result of that, it's compulsory for us as US taxpayers to be sending money to the IDF, but it's a criminal offense for us in the US to send money to Hamas, because there's a set of laws, material support laws for terrorism, that means that would be criminalized, and there's people sitting in federal prisons right now in the United States convicted on those charges, right? So this is the kind of contradiction that terrorism enables, this kind of inconsistency, right? It's why it's plausible for people in the establishment media to make the first question that they have to answer before every other question, do you condemn Hamas? But it wouldn't be plausible for the first question that you have to answer before you condemn everyone else to be, do you condemn the IDF, right? Before you can say anything else. That just doesn't happen, right? And that's the, that you can't explain that difference in terms of, one side in this conflict is more barbaric or more, or carries out violence on a greater scale, because if that was the case, you would want the condemnation first of IDF before anyone else. But it's actually about a certain function of the language of terrorism that enables that focus on Hamas as the default kind of moral problem in the story, right? There's nothing more rational or proportionate about the IDF's violence, right? They're also, of course, they're involved in a much greater degree of violence than anyone else in this conflict, right? So, what the term terrorism obscures is also this kind of thing that is about the relational nature of any situation of insurgent and counterinsurgent violence, right? So, in all the examples that I gave earlier of examples where the notion of terrorism was used, these are always these are armed struggles where there's a relationship between that armed struggle and prior forms of state violence, typically, right? So, so take, for example, the anarchists. It was the experience of surviving the Paris Commune and the mass state violence that crushed the Paris Commune that led to them pursuing a path of armed struggle. In South Africa, it was the Sharpeville massacre in 1960 when young people in the movement were shot at and killed on a huge scale. And so then the ANC decides, well, okay, we need to have some capacity to carry out a campaign of sabotage and perhaps armed struggle in response to that. Same with the PLO after 1967. They'd been like trying to get a solution for a couple of decades through diplomacy, through other methods. That had all failed, so they turned to an armed struggle. Same with the Black Liberation Army, same with the Weather Underground, having seen their comrades killed by the state, and so on. Right? That's not to say any of those decisions to use violence are justified. It's more about saying that we need to understand that state policies create the conditions in which that kind of violence becomes more likely, right? Political violence is always relational, right? In other words, it's about this kind of back and forth and exchange of violence between us on our side, the governments that operate on behalf of us, as it were, and insurgents that these governments are targeting, right? And then finally, since the war on terror, the term terrorism has become inevitably bound up with anti-Muslim racism, right? And it implies a way of thinking in which the world is kind of divided between antagonistic civilizations, this kind of idea of the clash of civilizations. On the one side, the West, on the other side, the Islam. And of course, Israel it defines itself, it places itself in the West, sharing Western values and all that kind of stuff. And then on the on our side, we're supposed to have reason and modernity. On their side, it's supposed to be fanaticism and barbarism. And so it's this old kind of colonial formula. And this enables us to create this kind of image of ourselves as innocent. And that's in the end what the term terrorism does, is gives us this sense of our own innocence. It hides the violence that we're complicit in. And for the US ruling class, the language of terrorism is now, I think, having had decades of the war on terror and certain things before then, it's deeply embedded as part of their kind of repertoire of vocabulary of rule, techniques of rule, and so on. It's a congealed ideology, if you like, and it's I think a major element in this kind of almost instinctive rejection amongst the ruling elites of any kind of support for the Palestinian cause, and so it enables us to avoid facing up to the US's own complicities in this violence and postponing any potential political solution through this kind of moral condemnation of one side in this conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we'll continue the conversation with Dr. Mitri Raheb, and you're going to share your screen, which I can see. So I imagine everyone else can also see it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I will speak about Christian Zionism and as the Christian lobby supporting settler colonization in Palestine. And what I'm arguing for is that there is an urgent need to redefine Christian Zionism. many people who are working on Christian Zionism were focusing on the evangelical brand of Christian Zionism. And I think this is very misleading, as if these people are, crazy, they misinterpret the Bible, etc. But Christian Zionism comes in many shapes and manifestation. It is deeply rooted in evangelical circles, but also in mainline churches, as well as in liberal theology. And there is also a more cultural and less Christian brand of Christian Zionism among secular people. Today, Christian Zionism is widespread even in the global south, more so than maybe in the US. And there is the newest brand is what I call the Muslim Zionism, detected in some Arab and Muslim countries in the Gulf region. And so when I tried in my newest book to redefine Christian Zionism, I came up with this definition that I think explains much better what Christian Zionism is, namely as a Christian lobby that supports the Jewish settler colonialism of Palestinian land using scriptural construct within a meta-narrative while taking global consideration into account. And so if we look at this definition, what it implies, first of all, it less focused on the biblical discourse of Christian Zionism, that verse on this verse, because again, Christian Zionism can vary considerably from literalist to post-Holocaust theology, from conservative to liberal. Then the emphasis of our definition is on the lobbying aspect of Christian Zionism. So I'm not so much interested in what people believe, but what they do based on that belief. So their action. Then the Christian Zionist narrative is always embedded within a meta-narrative. There is something much bigger, so that those who espouse it do not see themselves as engaged in pure political lobbying, but rather as agent of a grand plan from which they read and interpret both scripture and history. But alongside the meta-narrative, Christian Zionists are always connected to local issues and consideration, thereby combining their ideas with struggles and fears in their specific context. So while they lobby for Israel, they are actually lobbying for other issues important to their context, like fighting abortion, for example, in the States. Finally, Christian Zionist support for the Jewish colonial settler has less to do with head knowledge rather than with heart knowledge. It's something very emotional. Now, the meta-narrative changes depending on time and place and context, and the local consideration vary depending on the context. But what all Christian Zionists have in common is an emotional attachment to the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. That has to do with this heart knowledge that I'm talking about. So in this approach, the hermeneutical key to understanding Christian Zionism is not so much the biblical hermeneutic, but rather the lobbying aspect in support of settler colonialism. Because sometimes, I hear people think, quoting this verse from the Bible or that verse and saying Christian Zionism had it all wrong. That doesn't help us understand the phenomenon of Christian Zionism because we don't look at the lobbying aspect of it. And here I would like now to look at, when I talk about settler colonialism, this is not like my invention. I here take the lead from scholars who worked on settler colonialism. Basically, settler colonialists come to settle an occupied land permanently, exercising state sovereignty and control over the indigenous land while ultimately aiming to eliminate the native people. So that's important. They want to eliminate the native people to replace them. This is what we see happening in Gaza. And so the natives, they become aliens while the settlers are cast as natives. And the indigenous land is described as terra nullius, empty, barren land, just waiting to be discovered, thus becoming the private property of the settlers. Here you have in the States, for example, the whole discovery, doctrine of discovery. And the native people are depicted with racist construct as savage, violent, and terrorist, while the settlers are portrayed as the civilized and brave pioneers. And we hear from the two former speakers more on that. And to defend the settler property from the savage, a police state is created and is granted extraordinary power over the native people, including power over their civil affairs, which leads then to apartheid as the mechanism to do that. So basically, Christian Zionists are lobbying for these elements that are described here. And here I would like very quickly to look at three different brands of Christian Zionism. The one in British, in the UK, which started really in the middle of 19th century. Shaftesbury, Lord Shaftesbury was one of the main figure in that. And here I have two quotations from him, one from 1839, the other from 1854. And the years are important because 1839 was the year when the European powers defeated Muhammad Ali and his son Ibrahim Pasha from Syria and Palestine, and pushed him back to Egypt. And so Palestine suddenly was ready for colonization. And this is what Shaftesbury sees and what he really pushed for. And then 1854 was the Crimean War. Again, Palestine was in the focus of that war. And here we see Shaftesbury saying there is a country without a nation without a country, and that Palestine should be given to European Jews, which really led later to the Balfour Declaration. And Balfour himself in 1922, he explained the theological reasoning behind the Balfour Declaration, which we can see here. So both Shaftesbury and Balfour were actually Christian Zionists. And so they were active lobbyists for a settler colonial project in Palestinian land. I said there is always a meta-narrative, and the overarching meta-narrative in this case is to further the interests of the British Empire, with the British Jews as a subcontractor of imperial expansion. So for both Shaftesbury and Balfour, the empire, the British Empire was the meta-narrative. Everything else was in service of the empire. But also they have a local consideration. For Shaftesbury, it was really, he believed in the imminent second coming of Christ. And so he wanted to convert Jews to Christianity, because also he was the president of the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews. While for Balfour, it was important because the local consideration, he didn't want the poor Russian Jewish immigrant to flood the UK. So he diverted them to Palestine. That was his local consideration. And so here we see one brand of Christian Zionism. The second brand I would like quickly to look at is that in Germany, especially with the Holocaust. And here I would like to start with a short story. Friedrich Wilhelm Marquardt was very famous, well-known German theologian. He was actually socialist, so he's not at all a conservative evangelical like Shaftesbury. On the contrary, in South Africa, actually, he was against apartheid. But in Palestine, his situation was different. He wrote this book, The Jews and Their Land. And I had a discussion with him. I was on panel with him one day in Bethlehem. And after I gave my presentation on contextual theology, he looked at me and said, Reverend Raheb, if I were you, I will pack my luggage and leave the country for its lawful heirs, which are the Jews. Basically, he said, you are standing God in the way. Imagine, this is from a liberal socialist theologian saying this to me. And actually, all of these theologians, many of them, they try to prove that the land plays an important role in the New Testament. They emphasized this Jewish Zionist idea of the unity between God, people, and land. The people being the Jewish people and the land being Palestine. Interestingly, Marquardt praised the realpolitik of Balfour. And for him, he stated that the state of Israel was the bearer and fulfiller of God's promises and has the potential to realize the kingdom of God for Israel and the nation on earth. I mean, so, these people were very much, adoring the state of Israel. This is in the late 70s. And so these are Christian theologians as Israel's agent. By the way, they do this for free. All of them were students of one German theologian called Karl Barth, very famous Reformed theologian. Here I'm quoting Paul von Buren, actually an American theologian who was also a student of Karl Barth. And I would read this because you can understand. This is a very liberal theologian, so not conservative, not evangelical, not one of these crazy people, not at all. So he says, the role of the Christian church is to extend the revelation of the God of Israel to the nations. Christianity should do this not only by preaching this gospel to the nations, but also by rendering service to the people of Israel. This service takes an external and internal form. Externally, the Christian church must become the extension of the Anti-Defamation League, so Green Platt, combating all anti-Semitism among Gentiles. Imagine. It also takes the form of defensive of the state of Israel, both raising money for Israel defense, imagine, defense of the state of Israel, defense, and defending the state of Israel against all anti-Zionist calumny. All criticism of the state of Israel, whether based on alleged injustice to the Palestinians or claims that Israel is unjust to third world peoples, are simply lies. It is the job of the Christian church to combat all these lies against Israel, being taught the truth by Jews, that is, interestingly enough, the government of the state of Israel. So this is a liberal theologian. So this is a totally different brand than the British brand. And we need to expose this post-Holocaust theology. If we look what is the meta-narrative of this post-Holocaust theology, is without doubt the Holocaust, the guilt, the shame. They were all influenced by Elie Wiesel, Rubinstein, Fackenheim, who required that the Holocaust need a radical theological response. Their local consideration was that, especially the war 1967, they asked the question, what if Israel would have lost the war? This would have led to a second Holocaust, which we should not allow for. But they all had local consideration. Interestingly enough, Marquardt served in Nazi army in Poland. So imagine. All of them came out of a program called Studium in Israel, where Marquardt was the president, and many were closely related to the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Van Buren actually worked there. So The last brand I would like to show is the American brand, and which is a different brand of Christian Zionism. And this brand really became very important after 1967, because 1967 war gave a boost to American Christian Zionism, and the branding of the state as biblical Israel accelerated after 1967. This had to do with the war in Vietnam. In the wake of countless US losses in Vietnam, Israel's victory over several Arab states was seen by many American conservative Christians as proof of Israel's divine election and as an American Jeremiah. But then, 10 years later, when Likud got to power in Israel, the Likud party understood the importance of Christian Zionism, and they started sharing a bed together. To understand really this brand, it's good to look at, for example, Vice President Ben's speech at the Knesset in 2018. He said, in the story of the Jews, we have always seen the story of America. It is the story of an exodus, a journey from persecution to freedom, a story that shows the power of faith and the promise of hope. My country's very first settlers also saw themselves as pilgrims sent by Providence to build a new promised land. So you have here the settler colonial history of the US basically seen as exactly what's happening in Israel today. In my book, I'm saying when the US looks in the mirror, it doesn't see itself, but rather Israel. And when it looks at Israel, it sees itself. Both are settler nations who occupy the lands of native people and push those people into small enclaves. And if we ask really what is the meta-narrative for American Christian Zionism, it is American nationalism. So here we are talking about really three different manifestations of Christian Zionists in three different contexts. If we look today, who is really supporting Israel blindly in the war on Gaza? No wonder. It's exactly these three countries, the UK, Germany, and the USA, where Christian Zionism is so strong. So we heard Sunak just a few weeks ago here in Jerusalem giving unqualified support in face of evil. You have this savage language. I like this quote, "You cannot convince yesterday's colonizer that today's colonizer is wrong." For Germany, again, it's the Holocaust. The security of Israel is German state Raison or Staatsräson. And he said when he was now in Jerusalem, the chancellor, Israel is democracy. The accusation being made against Israel are absurd. And President Biden saying, if there was no Israel, we would have to invent one. I don't believe you have to be a Jew to be a Zionist, and I am a Zionist. And the blueprint for settler colonialism, actually, we can find that in the Bible. And this is important. If you look at the book of Joshua, you would feel this is exactly, and it was used in all settler colonial project. The book of Joshua was all over used, and today it's being used from official Israeli officials. They talk about the second Nakba, which is exactly putting what the book of Joshua is talking about into action today, what I call the Joshua factor. And this is exactly what we heard Netanyahu exactly saying when he, in his press conference on October 27th, when he declared the invasion into Gaza. He said in the press conference, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you. says our Bible. So what is that quote? That was a quote from 1 Samuel 15 that says, "Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all what they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass." So basically, the settler. um Let me see how I can now leave this. Uh, uh, so, so yeah, okay. So basically, Christian Zionism as really the lobby for the settler colonial project in Israel today, but it has different brand, different meta narratives, and different local consideration. And this is why these people are important, because they enable, they provide the software basically for Israel colonization, while their government provide the hardware, the F-35 and the submarines, etc. And the software, Christian Zionism, is much more dangerous even than the hardware, because it gives the glue, it enables the hardware to be donated to Israel. I will stop here.
Thank you so much for that necessary context and nuance. Next, we'll turn to Isaac.
My name is Isaac Kamola. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm coming at this issue of looking at what activists who are advocating for the rights of Palestinian people, what they come up against in terms of a very well developed political infrastructure that has been created by the American libertarian right to create a series of interconnected organizations, think tanks, advocacy groups that have pushed for a whole bunch of right-wing policies, and I think that and are closely aligned with a Christian a Zionist, as the previous speaker talked about. So what I want to talk about very briefly is looking at the donor network strategy, the Koch donor network strategy, the kinds of political strategy that they have in place in order to achieve political ends. And then I want to look at how this donor strategy has been used to augment and to support Israel in the past month and a half, and the ways in which this political infrastructure that's been put in place to advocate a whole bunch of things, like to prevent carbon disinvestment and carbon regulation, to attack unions, to push privatization to K-12 education, anti-CRT bills, a whole gamut of other type of right-wing legislation has been kind of harnessed to also push back on critics of Israel. So what do I mean when I talk about the Koch donor network? In our book, Free Speech and Koch Money, Ralph Wilson and I look at a series of very activist donors that are organized around Charles Koch and the Charles Koch Foundation. They meet regularly at conferences put together by the Stand Together Chamber of Commerce, or Stand Together, which is an organization in which wealthy plutocratic libertarians come together and pledge hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to support political objectives and a network of groups. These donors include some of the major contributors to right-wing causes, such as the DeVos Foundation, the Bradley Foundation, as well as Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund. Donors Trust and Donors Capital Fund are outlets that anonymize funding, that basically make it possible for right-wing donors to give anonymous funding. And that what is unique about this political strategy is not just that there's a bunch of activist donors. We know that there's activist donors on um, um, we know there's activist donors on all sides of the political spectrum, but what is unique about this particular form of political advocacy that was kind of spearheaded by Charles Koch and those in his orbit comes from a very different conceptualization of how to create political change. This is a group of very radical libertarians. They're opposed to all form of government regulation. They're what Nancy MacLean calls property supremacists. Their ideas are not well supported, and they're very a minoritarian. But however, this group of donors also thinks that they're right, that they think that there are no public goods, there's only private goods, that we all live, or that we all should live in a radical libertarian anarcho-capitalist a world where freedom is market choice and market choice exclusively. And so in order to make these minoritarian policy preferences into law, they developed a particular strategy. Whereas most donors organize and most political activists organize around an issue, whether that is pro-choice, environmental protection, supporting the state of Israel, or whatever, the Koch donor network has created a strategy that they call the structure of social change, where they basically say, how can we implement social change at an industrial scale, right? Instead of looking at an issue and organizing around that particular issue, producing content and legislation and lobbying and protests around a particular issue, let's develop a kind of an integrated network of outlets that are working together and organize and cooperate together in an integrated fashion. Those outlets are then heavily funded and heavily subsidized, and that they work together in a regular and coordinated way. So in the book that I wrote with Ralph Wilson, we looked at the campus free speech issue that we're seeing the kind of descendant of that now in the anti-CRT legislation. But in 2017, 2018, and 2019, there was a bunch of highly controversial speakers that were coming to campus. Milo Yiannopoulos, Ben Shapiro, Charles Murray were coming to campus and were being protested. In our book, we demonstrate that the careers of this kind of stable provocateurs, the Candace Owens and the Milo Yiannopoulos, et cetera, were funded by outlets that were squarely that were funded by the Koch donor network, right? So not only were this kind of group of professional provocateurs and kind of trained and platformed by outlets within the Koch donor network, but the students that would bring those speakers to campus were funded by the same set of donors. Likewise, the media outlets that complained when these speakers were protested were funded by the same set of donors. The think tanks that publish model legislation about how to regulate campus speech were funded by the same donors, and the legislative advocacy groups like the American Legislative Exchange Council that pushed legislation that locked in a libertarian understanding of campus free speech were also funded by the same group of donors, right? So you basically have a bunch of outlets, a bunch of individuals, a bunch of personalities, a bunch of media groups that are all deeply networked together, that are regularly meeting and funded by the same group of activist donors, and that are working together in a coordinated fashion, and in a way that appears to be grassroots and organic, but in fact is highly minoritarian. So how is this played out when we look at the recent issue of Israel and Palestine? That there's a whole bunch of other groups that, on the one hand, this kind of general model of outlets that are coordinated and integrated. There's a bunch of first of all, I should say that I'm going to focus primarily on the overlap with the Koch donor network, and there's a bunch of organizations and outlets like those that have been funded by the Koch donor network that look at issues of Israel and Palestine. So for example, the Middle East Forum is is an outlet that publishes Campus Watch, and Campus Watch has been very active lately, writing outrage pieces about faculty who supposedly are pro Hamas or critical of the state of Israel. The Middle East Forum has also received $2.3 million from Donors Capital Fund and a third of $1 million from the Bradley Foundation. Similarly, David Horowitz Freedom Charter. Center publishes a bunch of magazines and online sources like Front Page Mag and Jihad Watch, which also have been very active lately, creating pieces that are critical the of ceasefire and attacking those who have been critical of the state of Israel. But in addition to those outlets that are funded by the Koch donor network, but also have an interest in the Middle East, a number of the main flagship organizations like the Heritage Foundation and the Manhattan Institute have doubled down on this issue of Israel and Palestine. So the Manhattan Institute and the Heritage Foundation are two huge think tanks that are heavily funded by the Koch donor network, and they have been very active in the campus free speech issue, and then more recently in the anti-CRT stuff. You may know Christopher Rufo as the political activist and creature of the right wing think tankosphere that is responsible for weaponizing the notion of critical race theory, right? Taking critical race theory from an academic area of study, turning it into a right-wing boogeyman, and disseminating that and making that a go-to attack on the right. He did that work from within the Manhattan Institute, and also within the Heritage Foundation, Mike Gonzalez and others published a whole number of quote unquote reports about critical race theory, talking about how it's the end of Western civilization and reverse racism, blah blah blah, and creating this whole narrative that these think tanks created this whole a narrative about the evils of critical race theory. It's not entirely surprising that in the last month and a half that Heritage and Manhattan Institute have really doubled down, published a bunch of reports, and as well as inserted op-eds in the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal and other outlets that basically push their position that is not only categorizing activism in support of Palestine as 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 evil and condemning that, but also linking it back to Black Lives Matter and to the racial justice protests. So basically, using that as a platform to say the left is out of control, they want to destroy America, they're anti-Semitic, racist, etc. And this has become a kind of cottage industry within the Heritage Foundation, the Manhattan Institute, and other major right-wing Koch-funded think tanks. In addition to that, you have a number of media amplifiers. Benkler and Ferris and Roberts wrote this fantastic book called Network Propaganda, where they looked at news coverage and social media use around the 2016 election. And they basically demonstrated that there's two media ecosystems at play in the United States. One they call the mainstream media, which I would prefer to call the actual media, that looks at that the main pillars of the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and other outlets that that Michael was really right in demonstrating they have this incredible bias and failure to understand the issue in Israel and Palestine, and have all of this kind of these tropes that are built into their really terrible coverage. And so that is bad. But what what also exists is this right-wing media ecosystem that is completely divorced, that doesn't even engage with that deeply problematic mainstream media that's organized around Fox News, Breitbart, Daily Caller, Daily Wire. A lot of those outlets themselves heavily funded by the Koch donor network and specialize in kind of creating disinformation that's highly viral, makes no attempt to really understand the issue, and is very clearly part of a political attack apparatus. On top of that, there's organizations like Campus Reform and the College Fix, which are political outlets that hire students to write outrage pieces about what's going on college campuses. So there's been a steady stream of stories coming out of the Campus Reform and the College Fix, identifying certain professors and what they said at a protest or what they might have said on social media. Those stories then get mainlined into this right-wing media ecosystem, and is resulting in a lot, or is contributing to the targeted harassment of faculty. And just one last thing that I want to bring all your attention to is that there's another organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council that I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. ALEC, what it does is it brings together, it develops, it works with what they call partners, private partners, which are corporate lobbyists and think tank folks. It's heavily funded by the Koch donor network. And then they write model legislation on a whole bunch of policy issues around the privatization of K-12 education, anti-labor legislation, anti-CRT legislation, the kind of like who's who, a stand your ground bill, environmental deregulation, tax cuts, all the worst legislation of the past two decades. There's model bills that have come out of ALEC. Right now, they're pushing a resolution for state legislators to affirm support for Israel and to condemn Hamas. And they basically they develop this model legislation and then send it out to their public partners, which are state legislators, and they're pushing this resolution in the state houses right now. In the last few years, they've also been behind writing the draft bills that criminalize BDS that has been passed in 30 states. So ALEC is a major kind of right-wing developer of model legislation and pushing those out into the state level. So again, the take home is that a lot of this already existing deeply integrated right-wing political infrastructure that appears to be a bunch of independent groups, that's actually deeply networked and incredibly well-funded, working together to help push back or to create a narrative that Israel's the victim, that criticisms of the state of Israel is anti-Semitism, and that to kind of tie this into a broader, integrated, and well-funded attack on all causes that they disagree with. So I think that's what I'll stop there, and we can move on to questions. Apologies for the technical issues. I sincerely apologize.
It is definitely not your fault. We can include your slides when we post the video. So I just want to thank everyone for this nuanced and rich and textured analysis of what we're facing and how we confront it and how to sort of clarify our movement work to deal with these multiple fronts. So we have about 11, 12 questions in the Q&A. They range from questions about AIPAC and ADL and their role in fortifying doxing campaigns, the effects of liberal Zionism, media coverage, social media and Palestine solidarity movement, language around resistant violence. What I think would be the best, since we have such a robust collection of questions, is to have our speakers go through and choose what they want to address, and then we'll take about 30 minutes to go through another sort of roundtable of responses where you can address some of the questions, particularly those that are directed at you, but other ones that you want to pick up. and also speak to each other's presentations to give you an opportunity to do that.
There was an anonymous question here that asked about that says a problem of supporters of Palestinian rights is figuring out how to talk about resistive violence without endorsing it wantonly and without endorsing the idea of causing others pain. What language could be productively developed for that? And there's a sort of related question here that says some in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, this is Steve, some in the Palestine Solidarity Movement assert that international law gives occupied people a right to resist by any means necessary. Others claim that Hamas's targeting of civilians, like Israel's, is a violation of international law. Your thoughts? Okay, so maybe I can kind of say a few things about both of those questions, and as they sort of touch on the question of violence and terrorism, right? So firstly, I'm not an international law expert, so I can't answer the part of it that's specifically about international law. But I think, so two things, right? One is for us here in the United States, who are in a position of thinking about what does solidarity look like for the Palestinian struggle, but we're not directly involved in that struggle ourselves. I think there's the first thing is to just take a step back and think about what does it mean to take a position on this question of violence, right? And what are we doing by making statements of condemnation of one kind of violence or another kind of violence, or trying to say, well, this is legitimate, this is illegitimate. I'm not sure that is our role. That it's something that helps us advance our cause. By doing that, I think there's a danger that we could get ourselves into situations where we kind of become armchair generals, like kind of commenting on individual specific actions that are carried out, or whether they're morally justifiable, whether they're strategically justifiable, and so on, when we really don't have any idea about what it would be like to actually be on the ground and having to make those decisions ourselves. So in my view, we should do the following. We should in general terms, we should say, of course, all human life is precious, right? We should be in favor of minimizing harm to other human beings, of course, right? That's what, in the end, why we're doing this struggle. And to apply that consistently means, of course, that we condemn that wherever there's harm to other human beings. But I think beyond kind of making somewhat abstract general statements like that, I think the language is really the language. If we're looking for a language here of what is the language we use, well, we have one, right? It's the language of anti-colonial struggle developed through the 20th century, which was the language of struggle that that the ANC used. It's the dilemma here. The supposed dilemma here was never a dilemma. So, for example, the Irish Republican Army, which had an armed struggle in the north of Ireland, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, which had an armed struggle in the north of Ireland from the late 1960s through to the 1990s, when they entered into a peace process and a political settlement was achieved. Now, through those decades, they were funded very largely by money from the United States. You had Senator Peter King directly involved in fundraising for that armed struggle, and that armed struggle used the language of anti-colonialism. It was possible for that to happen with a significant constituency in the United States without a kind of daily kind of need to condemn civilian casualties, right? And I think we kind of have a language here that would have been supported around the international movement to support the African National Congress's struggle against apartheid. Is another model here, right? That language, civilians were being killed in that struggle, but we didn't have to condemn that in this kind of way that puts us in an odd position in our relationship to those struggles, right? We can say that without taking anything away from the general position that, of course, that every human life is precious, right? I think I think I'll leave it at that, and maybe others can pick up on some of the other questions.
There was a question about the impact of Christian Zionism on the media. I mean, definitely there is an impact. In fact, Christian Zionists have they have much influence on many media outlets. Say in the States, I mean, Fox News is a great example of that. But especially in the global South, if you take like a country like Brazil, many of the media outlets are actually owned by Christian Zionists. Christian Zionists were very quick to invest in media when media was revolutionized. I mean, not the print media, but later when it became digital. And so I think their influence is huge. But again, that's not my area of expertise. The question about liberal Zionism is a very important one because liberal Zionism, I mean, these are liberals on everything except on Palestine. And they mirror basically the second brand, which I talked about, the German liberal post-Holocaust theologians who are liberal on everything except on Palestine. And so Jewish, liberals, you see the same phenomenon there. I did not write about that, but this is something which is important to tackle in the future. The question about the trauma, I'm not sure I understood it, but I mean, the problem is actually that Israel is trying to market itself as the ultimate victim, as having monopoly over victimhood, and that because of that, basically they have the special status. And we need to challenge that monopoly over suffering because no nation, no group of people should have a monopoly over suffering. I mean, who talks about the suffering of the Native Americans or reparation for them? Who talks about, the whole history of slavery and what African American went through, again, without reparation, etc., etc. So I think it is important to realize that no group of people can have a monopoly over suffering. I think this might help us see things a bit clearer. And
Yulia had a really nice question about social media and how it can be used and what the limitations. I think that's I think it's really helpful for me in thinking about the co-donor network structure of social change and the ways that they understand. If I had my pretty picture here, it'd be easier to describe, but they understand like different elements of different types of organizations as having a different kind of function. So academics provide the raw material, they provide the ideas and the foundational ideas that then get fed to think tanks. The think tanks refine that into model legislation that then get handed to policy proposals. So Heritage is responsible for writing all the stuff about, leftists support Hamas and are pro-terrorists, and they write all those white papers and those op-eds. And then it's the Alec's job to write the model legislation. These are integrated with each other, kind of working together in a kind of organized and coordinated way. I think that there's a tendency, and their social media approach is very similar, right? In that, organizations like Campus Reform or the College Fix or Turning Points USA very clearly understands the social media. They have a whole lab that develops memes and develops content to pump out into social media, and they understand it not just as getting a message out there, but as part of identifying people to recruit into an organization, to build numbers in order to push messages, and it's in this coordinated way. And I'm not saying that we should model that. We don't have the resources to do that. And also, this is a top-down hierarchical model that works with, if you believe that the world should be organized hierarchically, right, where those with the wealthy and that have the most money should be able to determine the kind of political system that everyone else lives in. But I think that what is helpful in that model, I think, for me, in thinking through the politics of social media, is that social media isn't just about like throwing stuff out there, right? I think that there's a ways in which the kind of turn towards social media and pointing at specific examples, like the Arab Spring or like Occupy, this kind of notion of this kind of spontaneous politics that kind of emerged from social media and kind of became this protest that kind of emerged organically. I think that that's a trap that I'm not saying that that everybody falls into, but I think that it's important to kind of think about social media as one component, and the kind of institution organizing the building is an important part, and thinking about how those are related together. So I guess that's a short way of saying that is that social media is not enough. It may be an important tool and component, but the kind of the building of infrastructure is also really important. There's a question about APAC and ADL and Canary Mission. I think it's really hard. It's really hard to follow dark money and funding because of the way that the tax forms work, what groups are required to disclose, which is a little, the time delays of at least two years in which they disclose it on their tax forms. And then you can't go and see who donated money to a particular organization. You can only see if an organization donated to another organization. So we're able to map out the Koch donor network because that strategy works by Charles Koch Foundation giving money to ALEC, or giving money to the Heritage Foundation. So we're able to kind of track the money that way. In terms of those groups that are supporting APAC and ADL, Canary Mission, is a lot harder. And it's also, there's not a necessarily the same kind of kind of infrastructural organized, people meeting at meetings, and so it's really hard to follow that money. I think it's still important, but it's that's an area that I need to do more work to follow that. Part of that question was an issue of doxing and how these organizations are spreading, or an organization like Canary Mission will write about a professor or write about student groups and kind of push that out into the social, and kind of that leads to doxing. If you or anybody that is facing doxing or targeted harassment, I run the organization called Faculty First Responders, where we have a bunch of advice about for academics about if you're experiencing targeted harassment, how to support yourself, and what your administration should do to support you. There is a question that suggested that I talk about Project 2025. This is absolutely important. The Heritage Foundation has written a massive, I think it's in the thousands of pages of document, that basically lays out their administrative strategy if a Republican wins in 2026. And basically, or in 2024, excuse me. And basically, the realization that in 2016, when Trump won, they left the transition to him. They basically decided that they're going to create the whole set of policies so that when that president is elected, that you can hand them the set of policies on day one, as well as the people to staff those agencies, and the map of what they should be doing. In Project 2025, it's very clear that supporting Israel militarily is a top priority. And then there's another question about how to disrupt donors. I've already talked too much, so I'll be short about this. Is that I think that it's important not to model the same strategy because we don't have the resources to do so. But I think it's also important to appreciate just the incredible amount of money that has gone into the system and the amount of social change and policy that has bought, but also the fact that it hasn't bought as much as it should. right? The amount of money that has been spent, they should have been able to achieve a lot more than they have. And I think that that's because organizers on the left tend to be smarter, work harder, more aggressive. That there's a way in which organizing on the left doesn't require the huge amounts of money. If you look at unions and what they contribute to campaigns, it's way more than the dollar amount than what external dark money, because they have that political infrastructure. So I think that the response is just going to be organize. That being said, we need to also have resources in order to do that organizing. So thinking of ways of grassroots donor directed funding, the way that these plutocrats fund organizations is that the donor sets the terms and then gives money to a think tank or to a academic center or a media outlet in order to do the particular things that the donor wants it to do. And what we need is a way for the grassroots to determine and to shape how that money is used, because then it would be done in a more democratic, just, and equal way.
Thank you so much. I just want to take a moment to just appreciate everyone for providing exactly what we need in this moment, which is clarity around what we're confronting and resources. And so at the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, what we will do, of course, is post this conversation. And then also there's a question about sharing slides and being able to sort of share the resources that you all are offering. So we can do that. I just want to thank you all again, thank our speakers, thank the audience, before we sort of close out and continue to do this organizing work in the face of so many deliberately obfuscating obstacles that you all have provided so much clarity around. So thank you.